Hello, music appreciation, music lovers at AB Tech. It's your instructor, Cary Fridley, and I'm here to introduce the next section of the ebook for you and provide an instructor lecture with the Prelude PowerPoint for this next section. So we're heading into part 5, and part 5 is called the 19th century. So the musical era that takes up most of the 19th century is the Romantic era. And it starts around 1825, and I think that's no accident that that is when Beethoven's Ninth Symphony premiered. And it's right before he died. So Beethoven's groundbreaking Ninth Symphony propels us into the Romantic era. So this all happens in the 19th century. So that's what the bulk of what we're going to be studying. We'll study the transition in there, and then we'll get into some romantic music from the Romantic era. So Prelude 5 is called Music as Passion and Individualism. So passionate is right. It's lush harmonies, dramatic, soaring melodies. Everything sounds like a song melody, even when there were no words. It's supposed to be about the individual human being's experience. I think you'll like it. The book has chapters 37 through 51 dedicated to the 19th century. So be sure to check your schedule and see which chapters you have assigned and complete the corresponding ebook quizzes that go with these chapters, which will help you listen to certain things in the examples. So let me give you a bit of an overview through this PowerPoint. If you click the next slide, the narration will start, and I will explain the types of topics we'll be studying in this next section. Music as passion and individualism. Here we have the timeline for the 19th century, and this is roughly the Romantic era in music history. So in 1803, the Louisiana Purchase takes place. 1813, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice published. 1815, Napoleon is defeated at Waterloo. Also 1815, Franz Schubert writes The Elf King in Vienna. That's one of the pieces you'll listen to in the book. It is a German art song. It's very scary, supernatural. 1838, Frédéric Chopin composes his Opus 40 polonaises. A polonaise is a type of dance in France. In 1840, new instruments. Adolphe Sax develops the saxophone. Also, Robert Schumann composes Dichterliebe. So we have Schubert and Schumann. Schubert composes many things, but most known for his art songs. In German, it's called Lieder. And Schumann is best loved for his piano compositions. 1841, Fanny Hensel begins composing The Year while in Italy. 1845, the annexation of Texas and the U.S.-Mexican War. 1851, the premiere of Giuseppe Verdi's Rigoletto in Venice. Rigoletto is an opera, and Verdi, he peaks throughout the entire Romantic era. He is the greatest Italian opera composer in the Romantic era. 1854, Stephen Foster's Jeannie with the Light Brown Hair, published in New York. I dream of Jeannie with the light brown hair. 1859, Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, published. 1861, the American Civil War begins. 1862, Victor Hugo's Les Miserables is published in France, highlighting the extreme polarization between the classes. 1870, first performance of Richard Wagner's Die Walküre in Hamburg. Wagner, the greatest composer of German opera in the history of time. One of the themes in Die Walküre is dun da 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 dun dun da 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 dun dun da 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 da. Very well known melody. 1875, Edvard Grieg writes incidental music for Ibsen's play Peer Gynt. 1877, Thomas Edison invents the cylinder phonograph. So finally, we have recordings. So when they first started recording music, they recorded all the great Romantic era orchestral pieces, because that's the time that the phonograph was invented. 1883, Johannes Brahms' Symphony No. 3 has its premiere in Vienna. And in 1899, Scott Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag, registered for copyright. Ragtime music, this was written for piano. Historians say that American jazz grew directly out of ragtime. So we have the origins of jazz right at the end. Music as passion and individualism. So the age of revolutions, people passionately fighting for what they believed in. Self-conscious break from Enlightenment ideals. So in the age of Enlightenment, very reasonable, order and logic. Now we have passionate individual expression. In the music, it began with Beethoven. Beethoven came from a low-class family. And one of the things he was upset about his whole life was that he had friends in the upper classes. He fell in love with upper class women and he could never marry them. And he would express how to his audience of wealthy classical music goers, you think I'm a genius, and yet I will never be equal to you because of the class system. So when he played the piano, it is said that he hit the piano harder than anyone had ever hit it before. So he was a very passionate person, and he expressed his individualism in his music during his whole life. The romantic tenets that are still with us, the idea of the artist struggling against society, so there's Beethoven, convention, the need for art to unsettle. They're trying to wake you up in the Romantic era. The work displays the creator's distinctive originality. It was fashionable to put yourself in your compositions. Wasn't vain. It was a romantic ideal, the individual person's struggle, everyone's struggle is important and real. Now, this passionate music expressing individualism is a sentiment that grew out of the French Revolution. There's a transfer of power from the hereditary landholding aristocracy to the middle class. We have the Industrial Revolution, which is urban commerce and industry, brought people to the cities. And there's a new society in the cities based on free enterprise. And music is part of that. Increasingly democratic character. New ideas about democracy. Sympathy for the oppressed. Interest in peasants, children. Faith in humankind, human destiny. And the music reflects this. The terms liberty, equality, and fraternity inspired the artists of this time. Romantic writers and artists, they rebelled against conventional concerns. Why does everything have to keep on existing like it has been? Let's shake things up. They are drawn to fanciful, picturesque, and passionate aesthetics. The art is intense, individual, and emotional expression is emphasized. There is an artistic revolt against classical formalism. So this is kind of new. Even in the Renaissance and the Baroque, they drew from classical ideals. So now there's a revolt against classical formalism. In Germany, we have Heinrich Heine, who writes a new lyric poetry. He is part of the Sturm und Drang movement, storm and stress. In France, Victor Hugo, the greatest French prose writer, he wrote Les Miserables and also The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And in England, we have Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, John Keats, and their poetry is emotional and lyrical. The romantic ideal of the bohemian artist is popular during the 19th century. And this is a romantic idea about how the artist lives. He's cut off, or she, cut off from society, indifferent to the public, rejected dreams. The hopes of the French Revolution are not realized. There's short-lived optimism, doubt, and disenchantment. The romantic mood is an eternal longing, regret for lost happiness of childhood, discontent, pessimism. It's a dark artistic period. The eternal longing reminds me of the troubadours and trouvères courtly love songs, because the lovers are never together. The man has been on the sea for 7 years, or he's fighting in the war, and it's always this intense longing. So it's an interesting throwback. Schumann writes a group of small piano pieces called Scenes from Childhood. So that goes along with the regret for a lost happiness of childhood. Discontent, pessimism. Romantic themes. The conflict between individual and society. That would be a good discussion. If we were having class, I would ask you, where do you see what kind of conflicts exist between individual and society, even today? Beethoven, for sure, had a conflict. If you were in a lower class, you might not have the same opportunities, absolutely, as the upper class person. You might be an artist, but having to work in a job to support your family and not get to be an artist, things like that. There's a glamorization of the past. Anything that puts you in a fantasy world is game for the Romantic era. The idea that there's more to life than meets the eye. So longing, dreaming of lost loves or memories, that is dream world. Glamorizing the past, same kind of thing. You can be depressed and live completely in a dream world. Strangeness and wonder. So the idea of kind of having your mind blown is popular during the 19th century. Here we have a romantic painting. It's very passionate. She definitely stands out as an individual against her backdrop of all the other people. The spirit of the French Revolution is captured in Liberty Leading the People by Eugene Delacroix, who lived from 1798 to 1863. This is another painting by the same artist, The French Conquest of Algeria. in northern Africa inspired this painting of an exotic harem, the Women of Algiers, 1834. This painting, just my first impression of this painting is a break from classical ideals in art, because it's unlike any painting we've seen so far. It's also romantic in the way that it evokes sympathy for the oppressed. The dramatic character of the Romantic movement. Honoré Daumier, it's called The Burden. He lived 1808 to 1879, so squarely in the 19th century. Some more themes in Romantic art. The longing of far-off lands. The supernatural. There is a dream world. Did that really happen? What was that? Is that true? I don't know. Profound meditations on life and death. Romanticism in music. This is the time of the Industrial Revolution, and instruments are machines. And we have technical improvements to the instruments, and they are more affordable and responsive. Responsive means when you activate the tone, it speaks right away. That's a good instrument. If you have a guitar, it's well made. When you pluck the string, boom, the sound comes out loud and clear. So that will be very helpful in expressing passionate emotions. We get new public concert halls because we have cities developing. The orchestras increased in size. They add new instruments to the orchestra. And when you have new instruments, you have new colors, sound colors, tone colors. And the French word for that is timbre. So there are varied timbres in the orchestras. New colors come out of the orchestra. They pair different instruments together in new ways and create new sounds. It's very interesting. Extended range. So the orchestra, the instruments could play lower than they could before and higher than they could before. We have the invention of the piccolo, which plays twice as high as a flute. We also have the invention of the tuba, which is a new brass instrument that plays lower than any brass instrument had ever played before. Extremes in dynamics, so loud and soft, loud and soft are more easily maneuvered with these new instruments. So you can have louder and softer, and you can go to them more easily because the instruments work better. And in the music, you can have sweeping contrasts that occur more rapidly than before. Now, when I was talking about how they were pairing different instrument groups together in the orchestra, like they would pair the flutes with the French horns and would create a whole new tone. The composer sets that up, writes it out. They're going to play by themselves and writes out their notes, and everyone else has to be quiet. And that's called orchestration. What instruments you group together and the sounds that you get out of those. And that's kind of a new art in the Romantic era. So there's new levels of orchestration. The orchestra is larger, new instruments. The existing instruments play better than they ever have before. So it's a new creative tool. The conductor is the central figure. Now, I think this is covered early on in the ebook, but the conductor is the person that stands in the middle, and their most basic job is to keep the tempo. And they do this with a hand pattern. 1 is down, 2 is across, 3 is out the other side, and 4 is up. The orchestra learns to follow that, and everyone will be playing at the same time. And the bigger the group gets, the more important the conductor is. Conductor also now is responsible for translating the composer's instructions in terms of dynamics, feel, tempo. All right, going on. There's a new drama to music. The musical vocabulary becomes more developed. We have new, highly expressive terms to accommodate these new levels of expression. For example, dolce means soft and sweet. Cantabile, song-like. Dolente, maestoso, giocoso, con amore, with love. Expanded dynamic range. Rising tide of nationalism. So patriotism, for whichever country you're in, patriotic music. Everyone has to have their own national anthem, and that comes about during the late 1800s. There's a diversity of nationalistic expressions, and some of the best ways to represent the culture you are from is to use recognizable folk songs and dances. Enriched melodic, harmonic, and rhythmic language. So this, using the old primitive folk melodies from different countries, which would all be different, it enriched the language of classical music. Exoticism, faraway lands as inspiration. Lose yourself in dreaming about an exotic place. The music will help you. Romantic style traits. The instruments sing. It's aesthetically your goal to sound like a human being individually singing. Melodies with immediate appeal, marked lyricism. So a song that you could sing yourself or go home singing after the concert. Highly expressive harmony, more chromatic and dissonant. So they used all the tonal sounds, not just the pleasing ones. The tension causing sounds as well. They expanded the classical era instrumental forms, meaning instead of just having a sonata for an instrument or a concerto, they came up with new forms because they're revolting against the classical ideals. They come up with forms with fewer rules. So the new orchestral forms in the Romantic era are the symphonic poem, which it just is this happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens, and then it's over. It's supposed to unfold like a person's life with progressing to the end. So no repeated sections, no A, B, B, that's all out the window in a symphonic poem. The choral symphony, Beethoven's last symphony, was the first choral symphony ever written. So he added a double choir in the final movement of his symphony, which had never been done before. And now there are works for solo voice and orchestra, which is new. Music drew closer to the other arts. This is a photograph from the musical Les Miserables, based on Victor Hugo's book, novel of the same name, written in 1862. It's all about the French Revolution, the rallying cry of the French people. This picture is from 1993, a performance in Madrid, Spain, of the stirring musical. In America, Edgar Allan Poe is an influential romantic poet. Here's an engraving from based on his famous poem, The Raven, published in 1845. This is an illustration from his collection of poems, and the illustration is by Charles Joseph Staniland, 1838 to 1916, so late Romantic. The line I remember from The Raven is, "Quoth the raven, nevermore." This chart shows the new expanded orchestra in the Romantic era. So they have picked 3 composers: early, middle, late, and late, looks like. So Berlioz, he had your regular strings there, violins, 1, 2, violas, cellos, double basses, and 2 harps. So that's new, having 2 huge harps in the orchestra. Woodwinds, 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 1 on the piccolo, the new piccolo, 2 clarinets, 1 on the E-flat clarinet, an English horn, new, and 4 bassoons. Used to only be 1 bassoon. And the brass, 4 French horns, 2 cornets, 2 trumpets, 3 trombones, and a bass trombone, new instrument, and 2 ophicleides, tubas. And the percussion section is expanded, at least for Berlioz and Tchaikovsky. Berlioz has the timpani, which has been standard since the orchestra began. Now we have cymbals, the snare drum, the bass drum, and the chimes. So Brahms didn't add the harps. He has 2 bassoons and a contrabassoon, which is even lower than a bassoon. It's like a bass bassoon. In the brass, he kept it similar to the old days, as well as the percussion. Now, Tchaikovsky is known as the greatest orchestrator of all times, and he learned to be an orchestrator because he wrote the music for the Russian ballet. So he illustrated all these stories with the music that was for dancing. And he came up with some wonderful colors and new ideas. So he adds the 2 harps, he adds the piccolo, he adds a bass clarinet, he adds the bass trombone and the tuba. In the percussion, he expands it more than the other 2. A gong, triangle, tambourine, castanets, chimes, celesta, which is the little tinkly piano, a chime piano, and other special effects, including toy instruments, probably for the Nutcracker Suite. Performance matters. The musician in society. In democratic society, music reached the general populace. The venues are public concert halls and the aristocratic salons, which were also popular in the classical era. The musicians are supported by the new middle class. There's still some of them supported by aristocracy. Wagner was supported by his patron, the Archduke of Austria. But they didn't have to. They could be supported by the new middle class. There are solo performers that are idolized as stars by the public. For example, Franz Liszt and Niccolo Paganini. You can watch a video of Paganini. He lived to where, I guess, in 1920s when they developed films. Franz Liszt, a pianist whose hands were so large he could span 10 notes at once on the piano. Most people span 8. And he would play in such a fury and a fervor that women would faint. And people would get so revved up at his solo performances, he would do it all himself. And they said if you fainted or went into hysterics because of the music, you were suffering from Listomania. And that was a real thing. Women in music in Romantic times. A few overcame social stereotypes. So the successful composers were Clara Schumann and Fanny Mendelssohn Hensel. So Clara Schumann's father was Robert Schumann's piano teacher. And she was a young girl when he was coming to take piano lessons. And he said, "I'm going to marry you," when she was young. And her father said, "You stay away from my daughter." But they eventually did fall in love and get married. And she was a composer and a performer in her own right. And Fanny Mendelssohn Hensel is also a famous composer of piano works. And let's go on to the next slide. Here is the part of the outline about the patrons and friendships. So George Sand, a poet, friends with the composer Chopin. Princess Caroline Sane of Wittgenstein was Liszt's patron, and Nadezhda von Meck was Tchaikovsky's patron. There were organized salon concerts, and Fanny Mendelssohn rose to popularity in these salon concerts. So the aristocratic salons, just to remind you, are private parties put on by rich people who are interested in the arts. And often these people are artists themselves, and they would definitely support up-and-coming artists and want to exhibit their work to each other at these parties, the salons. There's a new idea of popular versus classical, highbrow and lowbrow. There's an aesthetic in the Romantic era that a talented composer like Beethoven could elevate your level of consciousness in the world and make you a smarter person. So people would go to the concerts to be more intellectual, and this is a new idea, and this kind of got out of control, I would say, in the 20th century. And that is where classical music audiences now have the reputation as being snooty and upper class only. So that got started in the Romantic era. This is a painting of Paganini, who was a virtuoso. That's Italian word that means he could go from any note to any other note on his instrument, and he had completely mastered his instrument. He could play virtually anything on it. This painting was painted in 1832 by Delacroix. This is an illustration of Franz Liszt conducting one of his oratorios in Budapest. An oratorio is a Baroque form of it's a sacred vocal work that tells a story from the Bible in a dramatic way where different singers represent different characters, and yet it's not acted out. So it's kind of like opera. And there is Franz Liszt, and you can see the harp, the double bass, the double basses. You can see the Romantic era concert hall and the women, the ladies in their hoop skirts. There's a bassoon. close to the foreground there. And he is conducting from the conductor's podium. He also wrote the music. Here's a picture of a Paris salon wherein the aristocrats would meet and have creative discussions and enjoy performances. A Paris salon concert from the series Soirée Parisienne by Henri de Montaut, 1825 to 1890. So he lived right in the middle his whole life in the 19th century. It's a beautiful painting.